FEMA EHP compliance reviews and project scoping. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, serves the United States during times of natural disasters to ensure all federal grant dollars are in compliance with all statutes, regulations, executive orders, policies, and guidances. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, specialists and managers coordinate with regulators to ensure compliance of all of our projects within 3 programs: hazard mitigation, HM, public assistance, PA, and individual assistance, IA. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. FEMA's mission. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA's unified mission is to help our states, local, and tribal partners prepare for and respond to disasters before, after, and during events. For a project to be eligible for Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, grant funding, the project must be the result of a presidentially declared disaster, and the action must be the legal responsibility of the eligible applicant. As in Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, Environmental Protection Specialist, we provide technical assistance to help our partners within disaster events so they may get back to pre-disaster situations or better with actions that are fully compliant and/or with mitigated impacts to any environmental or historic concerns. Sometimes hazard mitigation actions improve the project to mitigate repeated disaster impacts. The federal government avoids wasting funds repairing back to pre-disaster condition if the issue is going to repeatedly reoccur. Therefore, we improve and apply hazard mitigation actions when needed to ensure our use of funds can last through future disasters and not require repeated repairs. We mitigate future disaster impacts preventatively whenever necessary. Hazard mitigation plans for communities are necessary for local communities to improve their actions and help them withstand future disasters. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has the intention and mission to help people before, during, and after disasters and help applicants complete projects that are in compliance so they can gain FEMA grant funding. FEMA wants positive outcomes for all applicants. FEMA wants applicants to be approved for funding and assistance. FEMA provides technical assistance throughout each stage of a project once the disaster is officially presidentially declared and assistance is approved. FEMA wants to work well with applicants, stakeholders, and regulators to complete actions in compliance with much efficiency and effectiveness. This is why FEMA staff have the credentials and training certifications they have. Their professional background aids them in getting communities restored to pre-disaster condition or better through hazard mitigation actions. FEMA's intention is to apply hazard mitigation actions as needed and/or necessary to prevent repeated disaster impacts to applicants. FEMA employment positions. FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, specialists come from varying backgrounds. Some are archaeologists, environmentalists, floodplain specialists, historians, geologists, biologists, wetland delineation specialists, etc. My background is rare and absolutely perfect for FEMA because I have a Bachelor's of Science in Marine Environmental Science with minors in meteorology, oceanography, and nearly marine biology. Most importantly, I graduated top of my class at Vermont Law School with a master's in environmental law and policy. This offers me huge advantages for doing compliance reviews. Normal Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, EHP specialists do not have master's degrees, but I have one specifically from the #1 environmental law school. Most FEMA EHP specialists have experience in one of the 3 programs. I have ample experience serving FEMA in all programs HM, PA, and IA for multi-million-dollar projects and served Region 7 for 6, 9, and Northern Mariana Islands and Guam projects. My background also includes a long professional career serving in marine environmental positions, drinking water positions, remote sensing positions, broadcast meteorology, military, and hazardous emergency response positions. My expertise is mostly water and marine by trade, versus terrestrial land and plant-based. Historic specialists must have a background in sociology, archaeology, historic buildings, structures, objects, etc. for things both above ground and buried in the ground. Floodplain specialists usually have a background in water quality, hydrologic and hydraulic, H&H, study, and/or flooding. Biologists often are more specialized in fish, birds, and other species that may be impacted by FEMA projects. Their background becomes important as we ensure our projects are compliant with the Endangered Species Act. Climate change. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is also interested in helping communities address climate change impacts to their area. Yes, climate change is real. I collected scientific data Alaska to Antarctica myself, and the ocean temperatures are increasing and Earth is becoming warmer, which is impacting weather and climate on Earth to have more severe weather events and more frequent disasters in areas. Islands and coastlines are becoming permanently flooded, and nations are forced to relocate their major cities, i.e. New Orleans, the Philippine capital, as well as many other international cities. For FEMA, the most common natural disaster is flooding, which we say can happen to anyone, anywhere, hypothetically, and this is a direct impact caused by climate change. As our oceans heat up, the Arctic and Antarctic are melting and sea level rises for all nations. As the albedo or reflectivity of Earth is reduced due to our loss of Arctic ice and sea level rise, the Earth reflectivity is reduced exponentially in a runaway effect. Earth heating up becomes faster with time until humankind has no longer a capacity to do anything about it. Yes, climate change is an anthropogenic and human-caused issue. We can all do something about it now. This opportunity to do something will not last forever. At some point, humankind will go over a tipping point of no return where the runaway effects supersede our capacity to do something. The flooding of our coastlines and islands is of major concern worldwide. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP. FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, program performs compliance reviews for all FEMA disaster grants under the Stafford Act. FEMA EHP provides technical assistance on the formulation of projects looking at hazard mitigation plans to help communities approach challenges and avoid compliance issues. FEMA looks to make disaster prevention, recovery, and response actions as smooth and streamlined as possible while also mitigating future disaster impacts by implementing improvements anytime necessary. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, grants include FEMA EHP project reviews for different categories of projects. Emergency work. Emergency work includes Category A and Category B categories of work and is completed immediately following a disaster to save lives, protect public health and safety, protect improved property, or eliminate or lessen an immediate threat of additional damage. Project categories. Category A. Debris removal includes vegetation clearing, removal, and disposal, as well as construction and demolition, C&D, debris removal and disposal. Debris can include damaged vehicles, boats, vegetation, construction debris, demolition debris, sand, dirt, gravel, pebbles, and boulders. Category B. Emergency protective measures are conducted before, during, and after an incident are eligible, as Cat B work if measures eliminate or lessen immediate threats to lives, public health, or safety. or in a cost-effective manner eliminate or reduce immediate threats of significant additional damage to improved public or private property. This emergency work must be completed within 6 months from the declaration date unless the recipient or FEMA authorize an extension. Permanent work. Permanent work includes the restoration of disaster-damaged, publicly owned or certain private nonprofit (PNP) facilities. Permanent work must be completed within 18 months deadline from the date of President Declaration unless the recipient or Federal Emergency Management Agency (FEMA) authorize an extension. Permanent work consists of 5 categories of work. Category C: roads and bridges. This includes bridges, up/downsizing culverts, drainage ditches along the right-of-way (ROW), and paved, gravel, or dirt roads. Actions may be to repair or replace in kind with similar materials backed to pre-disaster condition, or it may include relocation of facilities to different sites or elevating it out of potentially hazardous floodplain zones. Category D: water control facilities. This includes dams, reservoirs, retention ponds, levees, flood walls, seawalls, aqueducts, navigational waterways, and shipping channels. Flood control and stream bank restoration projects. Flood-proofing of commercial buildings would be included under Cat D work. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Category E: buildings and equipment. Buildings to include all structural and non-structural components, i.e. mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, furnishings, contents, and equipment within the building. Equipment includes vehicle and construction equipment. Schools, commercial buildings, and individual house repairs would fall under Cat E work. The act of elevating or relocating properties out of the floodplain to mitigate flood disaster impacts would be Cat E work. Preservation actions for historic, archaeological, religious, or culturally listed historic properties would likely fall under Cat E work. Category F: utilities. This includes utility structures, water lines and storage facilities, power lines and generation facilities, sewage collection facilities, and communication systems. Category G: parks, recreational, and other facilities. This includes parks, mass transit, beaches, boat docks, as well as other facilities that do not fit in the previously mentioned categories. Please do like, share, subscribe, and comment below to help support this channel and help me succeed so I can post more for you. Thank you all for joining me. FEMA EHP Compliance Review Process. FEMA considers climate change by ensuring properties are prepared and we elevate buildings to withstand future flood events and do not contribute to climate change. For these actions, we may coordinate with other federal agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USFWS, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, HUD, state and tribal historic preservation offices, as well as others. Consultations with these and other regulators are required throughout the project formulation and implementation process. This consultation and coordination with regulators helps us ensure all federal grant dollars are utilized for actions that are in compliance and properly mitigate impacts whenever necessary. For example, for NHPA, we consult for projects that may impact lands with historic, religious, or cultural concerns and ensure environmental groups and interested parties are informed and can publicly comment on projects within their formulations well before the projects are implemented and actions are taken. This public comment opportunity is required and common for other statutes and executive orders to include the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and Executive Order, EO 11988 Floodplain Management. The consultation process itself may proffer public awareness and the opportunity for public comment. This is because hearing everyone's perspective on an issue only helps actions consider the impacts of actions and carry out the best possible action in the future by hearing these viewpoints, considering all, then implementing the best actions based on all we know and based on all resources as well as best available technology available to us. Informed decision-making is vital. We must be informed to be able to take the best actions in life. This is Leadership 101, very prolifically described within the Leadership Shackleton case study, which you can watch my YouTube video on located on my Level Up with Alyssa Mahan YouTube channel. Informed decision-making looks to maximize the positive benefits while reducing the negative impacts of actions within projects we implement. We look for the best available outcomes. Actions are to always be in compliance. Regulators are coordinated with or consulted with to ensure compliance. We use the best available technologies and consider the best available information in our decision-making. We maximize the use of federal resources and prevent waste of government time and money anytime possible. We look to mitigate repeated disaster impacts by considering the implementation of hazard mitigation actions. We take a deep look into what projects we fund and provide communities technical assistance so they can form planning documents and invest in the best possible actions for their communities. FEMA technical assistance looks to improve communities and management actions so they can withstand and gain the best outcomes within disasters. We will all experience disasters at some point. It is best to learn from the past, gain technical assistance, prevent worse outcomes, and minimize impacts caused by disasters. We should all look to avoid danger and risks to health and safety. We should all reduce risks to life. For example, northern United States in the New England area there is a very historic area that has an economy heavily reliant on tourism, especially of coastal and historic areas. The local government takes much time to ensure their beaches and coastal areas are in good condition. Like the local government, FEMA similarly wishes to protect these areas and resources. When we protect the environment and historic areas, we congruently improve our economy. When we don't comply and maintain compliance for our actions, we impact our economy. It is always best to be integrity-filled and do the right thing. We gain added benefits to the economy when we take actions to preserve the environment and historic areas. FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, program does this for us. FEMA EHP specialists do this for FEMA. FEMA EHP review processes look to consider consequences of actions so we can implement the best actions. Sometimes compliance requires added costs or procedural administrative actions, but in the end, if repeated disaster impacts are avoided, these added costs can outweigh the cost of future disasters in the long term. Compliance saves lives and in the long term saves money. Importantly, compliance preserves environmental and historically significant areas. Within the FEMA grant process, if an applicant has a project that is not in compliance, they risk an inability to obtain their FEMA funding for their project because FEMA legally cannot fund projects that are not in compliance. If the project cannot be brought into compliance, the project funding must be denied. The applicant at this point receives no funding for their project. FEMA sometimes cannot bring a project back into compliance when the applicants take actions that are not in compliance preemptively without FEMA EHP approval, which they can gain through technical assistance. FEMA EHP looks to guide applicants toward compliant actions. Applicants usually risk approval of funding when they do not coordinate with FEMA EHP to gain technical assistance prior to taking actions. FEMA EHP is not the enemy, instead a huge asset to applicants because they help applicants get funding by maintaining compliance through most efficient and effective actions that are streamlined and smoother than if they did not coordinate with FEMA EHP specialists. This proactive coordination reduces delays and risks to gaining approval of FEMA grants. This is why FEMA projects are formulated by the PA and IA program, then gain a FEMA EHP review prior to actions being carried out. We must ensure the project is in compliance prior to actions being carried out to ensure funding is not risked and to ensure actions are smoothly carried out with avoidance of any issues. FEMA EHP reviews mitigate negative impacts to the public, environment, and historic areas while fostering more positive publicity for projects. Communities gain bad press and publicity when their actions are not in compliance. More severely, they can gain civil penalties and fines when their actions are not in compliance. Lack of compliance can risk public health and safety. Lack of compliance impacts environmental and historic resources. Lack of compliance thus also impacts the community's local economy. FEMA EHP technical assistance helps communities avoid civil penalties and fines. FEMA EHP technical assistance helps communities enhance environmental and historic areas while also enhancing their local economies. FEMA EHP technical assistance helps communities be more resilient to natural disasters that affect us all. Communities that avoid disaster impacts altogether are the ones that are safest and best to live in. These communities save a tremendous amount of money. FEMA strives to reduce the consequences and costs of natural disasters through improved planning and the implementation of mitigation actions. Communities should avoid natural disaster impacts anytime possible. Community management plans are vital, and FEMA EHP technical assistance when forming these plans can be a priceless service FEMA provides to communities because it helps communities avoid and mitigate risks to property and life. When it comes to compliance, you likely cannot bring a project back into compliance retroactively once it is not in compliance. The only option for a lack of compliance is to risk getting denied FEMA grant funding. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. For example, for NHPA, we consult for projects that may impact lands with historic, religious, or cultural concerns and ensure environmental groups and interested parties are informed and can publicly comment on projects within their formulations well before the projects are implemented and actions are taken. This public comment opportunity is required and common for other statutes and executive orders to include the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and Executive Order EO 11988 Floodplain Management. The consultation process itself may proffer public awareness and the opportunity for public comment. This is because hearing everyone's perspective on an issue only helps actions consider the impacts of actions and carry out the best possible action in the future by hearing these viewpoints, considering all, then implementing the best actions based on all we know and based on all resources as well as best available technology available to us. Informed decision-making is vital. We must be informed to be able to take the best actions in life. This is Leadership 101, very prolifically described within the Leadership Shackleton case study, which you can watch my YouTube video on located on my Level Up with Alyssa Mahan YouTube channel. Informed decision-making looks to maximize the positive benefits while reducing the negative impacts of actions within projects we implement. We look for the best available outcomes. Actions are to always be in compliance. Regulators are coordinated with or consulted with to ensure compliance. We use the best available technologies and consider the best available information in our decision-making. We maximize the use of federal resources and prevent waste of government time and money anytime possible. We look to mitigate repeated disaster impacts by considering the implementation of hazard mitigation actions. We take a deep look into what projects we fund and provide communities technical assistance so they can form planning documents and invest in the best possible actions for their communities. FEMA technical assistance looks to improve communities and management actions so they can withstand and gain the best outcomes within disasters. We will all experience disasters at some point. It is best to learn from the past, gain technical assistance, prevent worse outcomes, and minimize impacts caused by disasters. We should all look to avoid danger and risks to health and safety. We should all reduce risks to life. For example, northern United States in the New England area, there is a very historic area that has an economy heavily reliant on tourism, especially of coastal and historic areas. The local government takes much time to ensure their beaches and coastal areas are in good condition. Like the local government, FEMA similarly wishes to protect these areas and resources. When we protect the environment and historic areas, we congruently improve our economy. When we don't comply and maintain compliance for our actions, we impact our economy. It is always best to be integrity-filled and do the right thing. We gain added benefits to the economy when we take actions to preserve the environment and historic areas. FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation (EHP) program does this for us. FEMA EHP specialists do this for FEMA. FEMA EHP review processes look to consider consequences of actions so we can implement the best actions. Sometimes compliance requires added costs or procedural administrative actions, but in the end, if repeated disaster impacts are avoided, these added costs can outweigh the cost of future disasters in the long term. Compliance saves lives and in the long term saves money. Importantly, compliance preserves environmental and historically significant areas. Within the FEMA grant process, if an applicant has a project that is not in compliance, they risk an inability to obtain their FEMA funding for their project because FEMA legally cannot fund projects that are not in compliance. If the project cannot be brought into compliance, the project funding must be denied. The applicant at this point receives no funding for their project. FEMA sometimes cannot bring a project back into compliance when the applicants take actions that are not in compliance preemptively without FEMA EHP approval, which they can gain through technical assistance. FEMA EHP looks to guide applicants toward compliant actions. Applicants usually risk approval of funding when they do not coordinate with FEMA EHP to gain technical assistance prior to taking actions. FEMA EHP is not the enemy, instead a huge asset to applicants because they help applicants get funding by maintaining compliance through most efficient and effective actions that are streamlined and smoother than if they did not coordinate with FEMA EHP specialists. This proactive coordination reduces delays and risks to gaining approval of FEMA grants. This is why FEMA projects are formulated by the PA and IA program, then gain a FEMA EHP review prior to actions being carried out. We must ensure the project is in compliance prior to actions being carried out to ensure funding is not risked and to ensure actions are smoothly carried out with avoidance of any issues. FEMA EHP reviews mitigate negative impacts to the public, environment, and historic areas while fostering more positive publicity for projects. Communities gain bad press and publicity when their actions are not in compliance. More severely, they can gain civil penalties and fines when their actions are not in compliance. Lack of compliance can risk public health and safety. Lack of compliance impacts environmental and historic resources. Lack of compliance thus also impacts the community's local economy. FEMA EHP technical assistance helps communities avoid civil penalties and fines. FEMA EHP technical assistance helps communities enhance environmental and historic areas while also enhancing their local economies. FEMA EHP technical assistance helps communities be more resilient to natural disasters that affect us all. Communities that avoid disaster impacts altogether are the ones that are safest and best to live in. These communities save a tremendous amount of money. FEMA strives to reduce the consequences and costs of natural disasters through improved planning and the implementation of mitigation actions. Communities should avoid natural disaster impacts anytime possible. Community management plans are vital, and FEMA EHP technical assistance when forming these plans can be a priceless service FEMA provides to communities because it helps communities avoid and mitigate risks to property and life. When it comes to compliance, you likely cannot bring a project back into compliance retroactively once it is not in compliance. The only option for a lack of compliance is to risk getting denied FEMA grant funding. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Natural disaster stages include the response phase, which is the immediate aftermath actions of the disaster, where, for example, we ensure all of our safety emergency structures and services are functional and available for use. For instance, lifelines like utilities, roadways, hospitals must be maintained safe, secure, functional, and accessible. Long-term recovery is where a bulk of FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation (EHP) reviews occur. This includes replacing culverts, repairing bridges, rebuilding schools, and repairing power line systems. Next, we look at mitigation to prevent disaster impacts from happening again. We do not wish to repair back to pre-disaster condition if the issue will likely just happen again. Here we instead implement mitigation actions to reduce the frequency or severity of future disaster impacts. That way, when the next storm comes through, we don't have the same flooding issues, same damages, and fix the same things repeatedly. Mitigation actions are critical and are common for floodplain restoration projects. FEMA spends a lot of time and resources into hazard mitigation and specifically has a hazard mitigation division of staff that are solely employed to provide hazard mitigation technical assistance for all FEMA grant projects. The idea is to avoid future impacts. The next phase is the preparation training phase right after we have recovered our communities back to pre-disaster condition or better. We then ensure we are prepared and well-trained for future disasters. Here we look for ways to improve processes to respond efficiently and effectively while also mitigating future disaster impacts. Stafford Act. The Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief Act, enacted in 1988, authorized the creation of FEMA and authorizes FEMA operations still today. The Stafford Act authorizes the President to make natural disaster declarations that authorize FEMA to respond and provide communities relief in the form of FEMA grants and technical assistance. Once a disaster is declared, FEMA begins to mobilize staff and resources to respond accordingly. All disaster response activities are locally led initiatives that start with the state, tribal, and local communities overstrained and in need of disaster aid. Communities reach out to FEMA to obtain assistance or resources to help them respond to the natural disaster either proactively or after the fact in response to damages observed. Communities get overwhelmed and request government assistance, which occurs when the President approves a disaster declaration for the community. Within the Natural Disaster Public Assistance Program, PA, Individual Assistance, IDA, Program, Hazard Mitigation Program, HMGDP, and FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, program staff all meet with the local stakeholders throughout the stages of all projects from formulation all the way to completion of projects. Once the disaster is declared, the preliminary damage assessments, PDA, occur for the disaster to determine the scope of damages, estimated costs, and potential resources needed to respond to disaster impacts for all projects holistically. Following a PDA, FEMA management can determine what staff must be mobilized on site to respond to the disaster most effectively. The PTMG then formulates individual projects and coordinates with all parties to complete a recovery scoping meeting, RSM, exploratory call, EC, and project worksheet, PW, review. Compiling project documentation can be slow, so in certain instances where a disaster has not been declared for several months, and the community is already moving forward to doing its recovery and rebuilding before the disaster is declared and FEMA provides aid. In these situations, FEMA EHP compliance reviews must occur after the fact once the disaster is declared and FEMA becomes involved in the undertakings. For compliance with NHPA, we must consult with SHPO, THPO, and HPO to see if actions can be brought into compliance. But if actions are not able to gain regulator approval, FEMA cannot fund non-compliant actions, so FEMA must deny FEMA grant funding for the project. All projects are reviewed individually for compliance based on their scope of work. Just because the regulator approves of consultation actions for one project does not mean approval will be received by the regulator for other projects. Each project must be reviewed separately. FEMA projects sometimes apply unanticipated discoveries clauses which apply when resources were not identified for the area initially, but reviewers became surprised by unexpected discoveries. At the point of discovery, actions stop so the site can be better assessed. A plan forward must become approved. FEMA and the regulator may inspect the site to determine mitigation actions to prevent harm to any historic characteristics of a site, as well as determine whether the actions to be taken are more benign or cause more severe impacts to historic property. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. FEMA EHP compliance reviews. FEMA EHP may review a project, then discover details about a project that triggers additional review or even a full consultation process. FEMA EHP must review the project details carefully to ensure the project remains compliant with all statutes, regulations, executive orders, policies, and guidances. FEMA looks to get applicants to the end with projects that are in compliance and funded by FEMA grant funding, but this can only happen with proactive, early, and often coordination with FEMA EHP throughout the project to foster informed actions that are in compliance from start to finish. Sometimes we just cannot recover from situations where the applicant has become non-compliant and FEMA must consider whether or not we can fund the project. Sometimes the planned actions to be taken are different from what actually occurs due to unforeseen circumstances, when reviewed in full may risk FEMA grant funding approval. FEMA must identify any inconsistency in the original scope of work in the final closeout review. In the end, it is important FEMA ensures that actions occur according to plan and an impact on compliance does not occur due to a change in the scope of work. Sometimes these changes require additional requirements to be implemented or full consultations be approved, which takes time. FEMA management completes a final review before project closeout to ensure reviews were completed with no potential to impact sensitive resources or no adverse effect. If we discover that some major departure from the scope of work as originally proposed has caused compliance issues, the project FEMA grant funding may become at risk to be denied at closeout, although previously approved. Please do like, share, subscribe, and comment below to help support this channel and help me succeed so I can post more for you. IA, PA, and HM. A large majority of disaster projects are public assistance, PA, projects. A disaster may also have individual assistance, IA, and hazard mitigation, HM, projects. Hazard mitigation, HM. Hazard mitigation looks to reduce long-term risks to life and property from future hazards and natural disasters. A presidential declaration sets aside a certain amount of funds for statewide hazard mitigation actions within the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. HMGP funds are used for a variety of actions and to improve pre-disaster conditions of infrastructure to avoid repeated recurring damages from natural disasters. Sometimes it is better to build better and stronger to avoid future natural disaster damages. This act of making things better to reduce future risks is considered hazard mitigation, and FEMA regularly applies millions of dollars annually, if not more, toward hazard mitigation grant program projects. FEMA, by applying hazard mitigation to projects, reduces hazards to a community proactively to prevent future issues. FEMA has a hazard mitigation division that staffs hazard mitigation staff who are specialized in these actions. The FEMA hazard mitigation staff can often be seen coordinating with applicants within each stage of a project and at the preliminary damage assessment, PDA, recovery scoping meeting, RSM, exploratory call, EC, and throughout the project worksheet, PW, review process. The hazard mitigation staff work with the PDMGs and FEMA EHP department throughout each phase of a project, from formulation to implementation to closeout. Personally, in Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands, we completed multiple multi-million-dollar hazard mitigation projects. Project descriptions may include improving schools to have storm shutters and windows, building new construction stronger with cement infrastructure, upgrading culverts and drainage areas to better handle increased water flows, slope stabilization, structural retrofitting, elevating properties found within the floodplain, installing utility lines underground, as well as other actions to mitigate against future flooding or typhoon damages. I truly enjoyed my Saipan FEMA deployment because I was able to complete compliance reviews for all 3 FEMA programs: Individual Assistance, IA, Public Assistance, PA, and Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, for multiple islands: Saipan, Tini and Rota, and even Guam for past projects. Compliance reviews are something I enjoy doing, especially as it utilizes my master's degree in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Hazard Mitigation versus National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. Hazard mitigation projects normally have added complexities and increased consideration for historic preservation that FEMA EHP must consider within their compliance reviews. The National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, specifically requires additional compliance considerations or requirements due to the project's scope of work to include changes from pre-disaster conditions through implementation of hazard mitigation actions. If we are lucky, the project's scope of work is covered as a National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, statutory exclusion, STATEX, or categorical exclusion, CATEX. If the project scope of work is not a STATEX or CATEX and instead requires more significant impacts, an environmental assessment, EA, or environmental impact statement, EIS, must be drafted and approved. NEPA reviews for more significant impacts can be rather complex and timely to process. Saipan expertise. In Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, related unexpected findings may include unexploded ordnance, UXO, unknown burials, and artifacts. There were many instances where unexpected discoveries were uncovered and the project actions had to be halted for the site to be fully carefully analyzed in a multi-person analysis that takes hours to weeks. Sometimes FEMA must also contract with UXO experts from nearby island Guam to uncover the potentially deadly unexploded ordnance. FEMA does not always have on hand the right personnel for unexpected discoveries, and sometimes the community itself does not have these experts on hand either. Saipan deployed local firefighting and emergency personnel, but the experts for deactivating and responding to the unexploded ordnance findings had to be retrieved from Guam Island and flown out to the site to respond once contracted for their services. Until the expert response actions were approved and processed, that site was in an all-stop, no-action phase. The project was delayed over a month because once the discovery was made, proper compliance and safety actions had to occur throughout the rest of the project's life. For this project, I visited the site and watched our archaeologists assess the site and meet with the HPO regulator who similarly inspected the site. Together, the HPO and FEMA archaeologists formulated a plan forward to process the discoveries and respond to the findings. Resources were deployed to process the findings anytime FEMA does not already have sufficient personnel on site. This is because sometimes we do not expect findings, but make discoveries anyway. For Saipan Island, it is a NHPA and ESA haven for discoveries. The island has a long history in World War II and a haven for many different Endangered Species Act, ESA, listed species protected under ESA. When a discovery is made, FEMA stops the project and coordinates with local and state authorities to ensure actions going forward maintain compliance and do not adversely affect historic property. FEMA may consult with local tribes. PW and SOW creation. FEMA requires a detailed and complete scope of work to assess potential impacts. When the scope of work is insufficient, we must submit a request for information, RFI, to the applicant for more information to be provided for us to be able to complete the PW compliance review process. If the scope of work is required, FEMA EHP may need to complete consultations with regulators in order to ensure compliance for more projects that have environmental or historic concerns or adverse effects. Applicant submits a scope of work that is fully reviewed and documented with photos, GPS coordinates, and detailed project information. FEMA EHP cannot complete a sufficient compliance review without a well-documented and formulated scope of work. When developing a project or writing up a narrative scope of work, FEMA EHP cannot account for the full potential of a project to affect resources without that comprehensive scope of work. Within the project scoping phase, the applicant may need to adjust their methods or actions slightly to ensure compliance of their actions, improve the project actions, implement hazard mitigation actions, or ensure actions are eligible for FEMA grant funding. The applicant must also notify FEMA EHP of any scope of work changes throughout all stages of a project from formulation to closeout because changes to the scope of work may affect compliance needs for the project. FEMA EHP may have requirements that need to be implemented to ensure compliance for the project. Requests for information, RFI. FEMA does complete requests for information, RFI, throughout the project to ensure we are able to determine the applicant's eligibility for funding, then also ensure the project is in compliance so FEMA grant funding can be approved. Response versus recovery. FEMA is not always available within disaster response phases when the disaster has not yet been presidentially declared, but FEMA is usually present during the recovery phase, so applicants do have access to FEMA EHP technical assistance within the recovery phase of a disaster. FEMA EHP is readily available to answer questions and provide technical assistance throughout the application process. FEMA EHP often meets with applicants within preliminary damage assessments, PDA, exploratory call, EC, recovery scoping meeting, RSM, and the project worksheet, PW, review process. Within each of these events, the applicant clarifies the scope of work, SOW, and FEMA EHP clarifies compliance concerns they may have as well as provides the applicant's guidance for completing actions in compliance. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. FEMA EHP Green Sheet. The FEMA EHP Green Sheet is a guidance document provided to applicants within the PDA, EC, and RSM events and accessible within the project's portal application documents that outlines and clarifies different FEMA EHP compliance concerns in a brief, simple way to include contact information for regulators the applicant may need to coordinate with and websites that the applicant may want to reference for more information. The intention behind the Green Sheet is to set the applicant up for success so they can maintain compliance for their projects and be approved FEMA grant funding through upfront sharing of compliance information and resources they can reference for more information if they have any questions. Ideally, an applicant that follows the green sheet guidance information avoids pitfalls that affect FEMA grant funding approval and streamlines the project implementation process, so actions are smooth and streamlined within quicker timelines so they can gain faster approvals, quicker funding, and quicker completion of work. Guidance documents and technical assistance is often provided in person, via email, via the online portal for the project, as well as via actual paper guidance sheets given directly to the applicants that clarify compliance for different project types well before any actions are even taken, i.e. within the preliminary damage assessment (PDA) stage of a disaster. Just after the disaster was declared, and FEMA is determining what resources will be needed to mobilize to respond effectively to the disaster. For this stage, FEMA EHP starts compiling information and documentation about the disaster and projects that will enter their queue for review. FEMA EHP here can start flagging potential areas of concern that may affect projects or their ability to be completed in compliance, so funding can be approved. Subscribe by clicking on my on-screen photo. We will help you level up your successes and foster the best outcomes in life. FEMA EHP focuses on major compliance triggers. For instance, the extent and severity of a ground disturbance, actions affecting historic properties or properties over 45 years of age, use of staging or disposal sites, projects that implement hazard mitigation actions, projects within a floodplain or wetland, projects affecting or adjacent to Clean Water Act, CWA, listed waterways, projects that may affect Endangered Species Act, ESA, listed species or critical habitat, etc. It is always wise to avoid taking actions until FEMA EHP has provided a technical review of the project, clarified compliance concerns, and provided direction on how actions can be taken in compliance, as to gain expedited FEMA EHP reviews and approvals of FEMA grant funding. Work back to pre-disaster condition with in-kind similar materials is always preferable to avoid unnecessary compliance concerns or challenges. When actions increase in scope, improve, upgrade, or make changes to the pre-disaster condition, the applicant risks needing NEPA compliance actions that can take weeks to years to process. Sometimes temporary work can be done to stabilize resources or repair damages until more permanent work can be completed. Applicants should allow FEMA EHP to review permanent work prior to taking actions to avoid taking actions not in compliance that are permanent and cannot be undone, which risk approval of their FEMA grant funding. Work needs to be done in order to provide safe access and help your community and return community back to pre-disaster condition so all can be returned to normalcy to the greatest extent possible. Applicants should definitely coordinate with FEMA and consult with regulators as early in the process as possible to ensure actions are in compliance and no risk to FEMA grant funding exists. Actions that may impact sensitive resources should be delayed until coordination or consultation can occur. Once direction and guidance is provided, the action can be carried out with less risk to compliance and less risk to your FEMA grant funding. This being said, some scopes of work, regardless of how much you coordinate and consult, will in the end not be eligible for FEMA grant funding. The scope of work not being eligible is not always foreseeable or preventable. The applicant should go forward with each project carefully ensuring compliance of actions. FEMA wants to help, assist, and provide aid to communities. FEMA will do their best to serve the community. Most projects receive funding, but if funding is denied, this only means you must do the actions utilizing your own money or try to gain funding via other means. FEMA EHP Common Requests for Information, RFI. FEMA EHP commonly requests photos for a project, age of structures and buildings. Will there be work in water or waterways? Will work occur within a wetland or flood zone? GPS location for sites, i.e. temporary debris staging areas, TDSR, or final disposal sites, FDS. If an Endangered Species Act listed species or critical habitat exist. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Consultations. For the National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, we consult with the Historic Preservation Officers, specifically the SHPO, THPO, and/or HPO. For the Endangered Species Act, ESA, we consult with NOAA/NMFS and/or USFWS. For CWA, we consult with USACE. For properties in the floodplain, we coordinate with the local floodplain manager. Public comment. Certain statutes and executive orders like National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, Endangered Species Act, ESA, and Executive Order, EO 11988 floodplain management require projects to complete a timeframe allowing public comment periods for potential stakeholders, environmental groups, and the public to learn about the project and comment prior to actions occurring for the project. Administrative actions. Administrative actions include, but are not limited by desktop surveys, personnel actions or overtime, actions with no ground disturbance, providing travel or supplies, procurement actions, drafting hazard mitigation plans, drafting engineering drawings or surveys, completing soil analyses, community crisis counseling initiatives, provide training, child care services, and food distribution services provided to communities. When actions do not have the potential to impact historic resources, they do not require the same level of review and are instead exempt from a more formal detailed review process. Feel free to check out Level Up with Alyssa Mahan YouTube channel to level up your life in a personalized way. See you there. Programmatic allowances. FEMA actions for NHPA include regulator-approved programmatic allowances that aid FEMA in processing compliance reviews and project actions. FEMA is able to utilize programmatic allowances to assess and implement treatment measures for projects. Programmatic allowances help FEMA streamline initiatives that have no potential to affect historic properties, i.e. administrative actions. Statewide programmatic agreement and appendices list all of the FEMA programs which trigger Section 106 review. Programmatic allowances list activities exempt from consultation but still have the potential to impact resources, so conditions are applied for each project that implements the listed allowances. For instance, a FEMA EHP project review may require approval from a FEMA specialist with specific qualification standards. For instance, when reviewing projects for disasters in North Carolina Region 4, Oklahoma Region 6, and Saipan Region 9, FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, staff may review all NHPA Tier 1 projects, and while I enjoyed making Tier 2 determinations, the determinations that are NHPA Tier 2 cannot be legally sufficient unless they are reviewed and approved by a SOI qualified historic specialist as required by programmatic agreements under NHPA in order to be legally sufficient. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Potential applicants coordinate with regulators. It is recommended that the potential applicants coordinate with the regulator directly early on within the project formulation stage, because not all projects start out as presidentially declared disasters. Even before the disaster declaration is designated and approved, the community should coordinate with the regulating authorities to ensure that if the disaster becomes presidentially declared disaster and approved for FEMA grant funding, the project actions are in compliance to not risk being approved funding when the disaster is declared and projects begin being processed by FEMA. When the disaster is not yet declared, potential applicants do not have access to FEMA EHP technical assistance to ensure their actions will be in compliance and mitigate risks to receiving funding. Therefore, the potential applicants should work with the regulator directly for all compliance issues. After the fact consultations. After-the-fact consultations are not ideal because they're not guaranteed to gain compliance approval by the regulator. FEMA works with the regulator, but if the consultation actions within the report are denied, FEMA must either continue to adjust the consultation mitigation listed treatment measures so they become approvable or give up on approving funding for that undertaking. The community at that point must carry out their project or do no action completely solitarily with no aid from FEMA. As clarified earlier, FEMA cannot pursue actions not in compliance. Thus, undertakings are found in compliance, or the community pursues them with no funding or involvement of FEMA. The community completes actions on their own accord. FEMA involvement at that point. Once the project is determined to be not in compliance, FEMA involvement stops. The community at this point continues consultations and carry out actions on their own with their own funding, utilizing their own staff and technical capacity. Stop or pause work. Whenever possible, FEMA can always hold off on permanent work. Halting actions temporarily to ensure actions are in compliance is always an option. Ideally, FEMA completes FEMA EHP compliance reviews upfront and early on in the project formulation and implementation phase, especially for ground-disturbing activities like bridge work, roadway reconstruction, tree removal, because these can have big impacts on archaeological resources, and these impacts can't be undone. If an archaeological site is damaged, we can't fix that. So, if possible, avoid significant ground-disturbing activities before FEMA reviews the projects. FEMA EHP importance. Ideally, FEMA EHP technical assistance is available early within the project formulation and implementation phase because FEMA EHP intent is to streamline and smoothen out the compliance review process and clarify how applicants can take actions that are in compliance both efficiently and effectively without risk of losing their FEMA grant funding. Reiterating, FEMA EHP's intention is to help applicants be able to complete their project and be approved of funding. To be approved, the project must be in compliance. Thus, the applicant must work with FEMA EHP and ensure the project is carried out in compliance. FEMA EHP helps the applicant and provides technical advising to help them maintain compliant actions so they can have their projects funded by FEMA. FEMA by declaration is authorized to help applicants. FEMA EHP wants to complete approved FEMA EHP compliance reviews so the applicant can receive funding. Projects are only deemed not in compliance, normally due to applicant actions, so any risk to funding is usually caused by the applicant themselves. If the applicant works with FEMA EHP, EHP only helps them gain approval of project funding for projects in compliance. FEMA EHP also consults with regulators on behalf of the applicant to form mitigation actions that are approvable so the project can be carried out. FEMA EHP is only a great asset for applicants. FEMA EHP streamlines and smoothens out the compliance review process and provides technical assistance that helps the applicant complete projects most effectively and efficiently. Here we will go into different statutes and executive orders for EHP reviews. Endangered Species Act, ESA. The Endangered Species Act, ESA, is another law that is commonly impacting projects and requiring special actions to be able to complete the projects. FEMA must ensure project actions preserve listed ESA species and their critical habitats. Smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 provides FEMA with a framework to follow for considering the potential effects of their activities on historic, culturally significant resources through actions focused on preservation. The National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, provides FEMA a framework for how federal agencies approach undertakings with respect to historic preservation through consideration of impacts prior to taking actions. Historic characteristics of structures and buildings are preserved due to National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA. Redevelopment initiatives can no longer demolish historic and culturally listed sites. There is a movement throughout the United States to maintain historic, culturally significant structures, buildings, objects, and sites designated by law. The National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, creates a process for considering the nature of effects on these significant resources. FEMA takes actions to protect our historic properties and consider the irreversible consequences of our actions on historically and culturally significant resources. Other cultural resource laws that foster historic preservation actions include the Antiquities Act of 1906 and the Historic Sites Act of 1935. The undertaking or actions performed by the federal agency must not have an adverse effect on historic properties, therefore consultations must occur and actions to minimize, mitigate, and avoid adverse effects must occur. The regulatory SHPO, THPO, and HPO must approve of the actions taken to minimize, mitigate, and avoid adverse effects. As we clarified earlier, FEMA cannot fund projects that are not in compliance. This is why FEMA EHP compliance reviews are vital to the FEMA mission. FEMA's mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. FEMA's actions make communities more resilient to natural disasters through improved management plans and hazard mitigation actions that foster improved health and safety, as well as prolong life. In Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands, I was lucky to serve FEMA Environmental Historic Preservation, EHP, as a manager that oversees compliance reviews for all IA, PA, and HMGP projects where ESA and NHPA were very complex compliance issues on the islands of CNMI. There were many archaeologically sensitive areas that were all covered by an Archaeological Treatment Plan, ADP, for archaeologically sensitive zones, ESC, and areas of potential effect, AP. The National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, requires federal agencies to pause and reflect on actions we propose to take or fund to consider the potential impacts to historic properties prior to pursuing an undertaking. Section 106 of NHPA states federal agencies must consider the effects their undertaking may have on historic properties to ensure historic preservation compliance. Federal agencies must evaluate as objectively as possible what effects a project might give rise to and ensure all is considered, well before the project implementation or undertaking occurs. A federal undertaking is defined as a project, activity, or program either funded, permitted, licensed, or approved by a federal agency if FEMA funding is involved regardless of what kind of project or action is being taken. There exists a federal undertaking as defined by the NHPA. Administrative actions like implementing payroll or purchasing supplies tend to have no effect on historic properties. NHPA regulators SHPO, THPO, and HPO. Historic preservation officers administer state historic preservation programs and advise and assist federal, state, and local agencies or governments in carrying out their historic preservation responsibilities to consult with them to ensure the project is in compliance with National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, Clean Water Act, and Work in Water. During project implementation, the work may have been expected to be performed in dry areas, then during the work it is discovered work will need to occur in water. At this point, one should pause work to coordinate with FEMA EHP to ensure additional permitting requirements or considerations are not needed to be implemented for the project. Work in water, floodplains, and wetlands require additional considerations and compliance actions. The applicant must coordinate with FEMA EHP early and often to ensure that work in these areas are implemented in compliance and permits are obtained, when applicable. Actions completed not in compliance or without proper permits may be denied FEMA grant funding. Thus, a proactive approach coordinating early and often is ideal for both FEMA and the applicant, as this streamlines the project review and implementation, so regulators are most apt to find the project in compliance, so the project can be funded in the end. Executive Order EO 11988 Floodplain Management. When it comes to Executive Order EO 11988 floodplain management, living inside the floodplain, for example, can be dangerous, so it is important to remove and relocate properties to safer areas that are not prone to flooding damages. FEMA completes hydrologic and hydraulic (H&H) studies to ensure their projects do not yield unforeseeable impacts to nearby communities by changing the flow of rivers or flooding to impact communities not previously prone to flooding. FEMA always looks to ensure human life is protected. Relocating properties, elevating structures, or flood-proofing may be required actions for FEMA to perform when they are completing their grant projects. The special flood hazard area and floodway areas are of real heightened concern because very dangerous flooding can occur in these areas. Subscribe by clicking on my on-screen photo. We will help you level up your successes and foster the best outcomes in life. Executive Order EO 12898 Environmental Justice. Executive Order EO 12898 Environmental Justice requires FEMA projects to not disproportionately impact certain populations. We must ensure minority and low-income communities are not negatively impacted by projects. Ethical fair actions are a focus to ensure populations have fair access to emergency services and mitigated negative impacts due to projects FEMA funds. FEMA looks to reduce burdens on communities and considers socioeconomic impacts and resources as we formulate, review compliance, and implement actions for projects. We consider present-day land use and how changes to the use may impact different communities. We ensure hazardous chemicals are not impacting communities disproportionately, but more importantly with properly disposed of wastes and cleanup sites to improve society regardless of who lives nearby. That is what compliance is. We stay in compliance with our actions with integrity because doing the right thing is required, not optional. FEMA reviews compliance for the following, but this is not an all-inclusive list and varies with locality, state, etc. National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, Clean Air Act, CAA, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, WSA, Farmland Protection Policy Act, FPPA, National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, Endangered Species Act, ESA, Executive Order 11990 Wetlands Protection, Executive Order EO 12898 Environmental Justice, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, Coastal Zone Management Act, CZMA, Coastal Barrier Resources Act, CBRA, etc. This video will not go into all of them, but you can check out other content to learn more about each of them. Comment level up to show you are ready to level up and watch this to the end. Ever-evolving world of compliance. Here you may want to go back and analyze this detailed presentation. There is so much to learn about this all. Compliance is always changing and ever-evolving. All states, communities, and disasters may have their own compliance intricacies. This is why it is important to gain experience in compliance nationwide or internationally if this is your field of study and you wish to be considered an expert in the profession. Personally, my compliance work was aboard a ship Alaska to Antarctica, Africa to Hawaii with NOAA, Bay Area, California for ACWD, North Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, Oklahoma, California, Saipan, Tinian, Rhoda, Guam, Hawaii, as well as Region 7, 4, 6, and 9 for FEMA DHS. My master's from Vermont Law School includes studies in international law and policy, so I am excited to apply this to my international professional work. Law is complex, ever-evolving, and varies worldwide, thus always be focused on refining your knowledge base and experience within this profession. Comment below, do you have questions about getting a job with FEMA? I can give you tips on applying. Comment below, do you have any questions about the EHP compliance review processes, categories of work, or different laws described? Do you agree climate change is real? Do you agree humankind affects the rate of climate change? Thank you all for joining me through the end. Please do like, share, subscribe, and comment below to help support this channel and help me succeed so I can post more for you. Thank you all for joining me. Talk to you soon on the next one. Click on the on-screen images to subscribe and watch more videos.